welcome in. I have a question for you. Has anyone ever told you that you act just like your mom or just like your dad or maybe like somebody in your family? It happens to a lot of people. And typically, when we're hanging out with people that we know or our family or whatever, we tend to pick up their traits. Like if your mom does something silly, like every time she walks past a door that's open, she has to close it, or something silly like that, you start to do it. Like you walk past an open door and you're like, oh, gotta close it. Like that's what it means when you pick up the traits of people around you. You just kind of start to act like them. So in our story today, luckily, the guy we're going to talk about did not pick up the traits of his dad and of his grandfather. And we're going to understand why that's a good thing in just a second. So our verse for the day, it's in 2 Kings 22:2, and it says, "He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his ancestor David. He did not turn away from doing what was right." So if we go back to 2 Kings 21 really quick, we're going to talk about a guy named Josiah. He was a king of Judah. And before he became the king, his father was the king. His father was Amon. And before Amon, his grandfather, listen, these Bible names are a little hard. His grandfather's name was Manasseh. And he was the king. Both of them were like really, really bad guys. Okay? But like our verse said, Josiah did what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord and followed King David's example. So Josiah's father worshiped idols, and he did what his father taught him. His father Manasseh, he built idols. He worshiped idols. He even put idols and built things for idols in the temple, which is where like God that we believe in lives. Like that is probably one of the worst things you could do. And an idol is just a false god. So I'm sure some of you guys might have heard of like the golden calf that the Israelites worshipped sometimes. It's where they took like all the gold that everyone had and melted it down and turned it into a golden calf, and they all started worshiping that instead of worshiping God. So that's what an idol is. So King Josiah's father and grandfather worshipped idols instead of worshiping God. So King Josiah didn't grow up learning who God was. He just, he probably heard here and there from different people and stuff, but what he was really surrounded by was just a lot of, evil. He was just surrounded by a lot of idol worship and everything else. So his father became the king, and he only ruled for 2 years before his people killed him. Like, it was not a pretty picture. So King Josiah became the king at 8 years old. He was 8 when he became king of his land. And it says that he was pleasing to the Lord. So at 8, he became king. At 16, he started seeking God. Okay, so he wasn't raised in church. He wasn't raised by his father, like teaching him who God was or anything. But when he turned 16, he kind of like had heard some things. So he was like, let me start figuring out who this God is. So he started seeking God for himself. When he turned 20, he started purifying the land and the temple, which means that he started taking all the idols that his father and his grandfather built, and he was tearing them down and getting rid of them. And the priests and things that were over like these idols and stuff, he got rid of them. Like because he started to learn that God was the right way to go. So he started purifying the land. And then when he was 26, once he had purified the land and purified the temple and started setting everything right on track, he sent someone to the temple because it started falling apart. The temple was falling apart because nobody ever took care of it, because they weren't, using the temple the way it was meant to be used. They didn't care about the temple where God lived because nobody ever cared about God. up until King Josiah came into the picture. So he decides he wants to start repairing the temple because it's, you know, falling apart. And while they're doing these repairs and stuff, one of the people working in the temple found the Law of Moses. Now, the Law of Moses were basically the rules that everyone was supposed to follow. Those were the rules that God gave to Moses when they got freed from slavery in Egypt. So he finds these laws and he starts reading them and he's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea what these were and nobody's following these rules. Like, God is probably pretty upset with us right now. So he started studying the laws. He learned them. He taught them to everyone that he was ruling, and he started to implement them. Or like he started saying, you know, okay, these are our rules now. Everybody, we're going to follow them. So he turned to God, and then he began to turn everyone else back to God. And there are a couple of things that we can learn from this story. There's 3 that I want to point out to you. So the first thing is, just because people around you are doing something does not mean you have to do it, okay? You know, like if you're at school and all of the people that you're sitting with at the lunch table are like picking on somebody, you don't have to do it, okay? And even if it's something that your parents do, just because your parents do it doesn't mean you have to do it. Like if, you know, your mom or your dad, like you're sitting at the dinner table and they just chew with their mouth wide open and stuff, and like that's gross. Just because they do it doesn't mean you have to do it. Or, you know, if you have like a sibling maybe that's going through a hard time and they're not really being very nice or whatever, just because they're not being nice doesn't mean that you have to not be nice, okay? You are your own person, okay? Just because you're a kid doesn't mean you have to do what everybody around you does. You know what's right and you know what's wrong, so you can be you. And you can make the choice to do what's right, just like King Josiah did. The second thing I want us to think about is the fact that you can get to know God by yourself, just like King Josiah did. His dad and his grandfather didn't teach him who God was. It says that at age 16, he started teaching himself. And you might not be 16 yet, but it doesn't mean that you can't teach yourself. Because at 16, Josiah didn't have a Bible, and you do. At 16, all Josiah had was you know, the opportunity to talk to God for himself, to pray, and maybe to ask questions to some other people. But a lot of the people that surrounded him worshiped idols. They didn't worship God. So I'm pretty sure that most of the seeking that he did was on his own, you know, just like talking to God and allowing God to talk back to him and hearing what God had to say. Because for 10 years after he started seeking God, he didn't have anything written to go by. Remember, he didn't get the written law until he was 26. He started at 16. That's 10 years that he was just seeking God by himself with no Bible or no laws to go off of, nothing written. And the last thing that I want us to think about, and it's the most important in my opinion, is it's okay to be different. It is perfectly okay to be different. You don't have to look like everybody else. You don't have to talk like everybody else. You don't have to act like everybody else. You can be different. Because people that blend in don't change the world. It's the people that stand out that do. And it's our job as Christians to stand out. We should be different. We should carry ourselves different. We should talk different. We should look different, and people should notice us. That way when people come to you and they're like, what's your deal? What are you doing? Like, why do you act the way you do? You can be, well, you can say, you know, well, I know a man named Jesus, and he loves me, and because he loves me, I don't have to worship idols, or I don't have to be mean to people, or I don't have to do whatever everyone else is doing. And if you think about it, Jesus was different. When he came and started, you know, operating in his ministry, like, people recognized that he was different, and he changed the world. So when you're different, you can stand out and you can change the world. So I want you to remember, just because people around you are doing something doesn't mean you have to do it. You can get to know God all by yourself. You don't need anybody to help you. Granted, it's good to have help, you know, to teach you things, but if you don't have anybody around to help you, that's okay too, because God is going to talk to you whether you have other people teaching you about him or not. And number 3, be different. It's totally okay. Just be you. Okay?